The scripture this morning is from the Torah, Deuteronomy chapter 34, verses 1 to 12. And Moses went up from the plains of Moab to Mount Nebo, to the top of Pisgah, which is opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land, Gilead as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, all the land of Judah, as far as the western sea, the Negeb and the plain, that is the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, as far as Zoar. And the Lord said to him, "This is the land of which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you shall not go there." So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, according to the word of the Lord. And he buried him in the valley of the land of Moab, opposite Beth Peor. But no man knows the place of his burial to this day. Moses was 120 years old when he died. His eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated. And the people of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. And then the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. And Joshua, the son of Nun, was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. So the people of Israel obeyed him and did as the Lord had commanded Moses. And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. None like him, for all the signs and the wonders which the Lord sent him to do in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, and for all the mighty power and all the great and terrible deeds with which Moses wrought in the sight of all Israel.
Would you pray with me, please? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your presence. For you are our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today we conclude our series on the Exodus. We have traveled with the Israelite people out of enslavement in Egypt, through long, hot years in the Sinai wilderness, and now in today's reading, just to the very verge of arriving in the land of Canaan. We began, do you remember those many weeks ago? We began with Moses' birth, when he was saved from Pharaoh's edict of death by the resistance of courageous midwives. We followed his mother and sister as they faithfully schemed a way to comply with the letter of the law that would throw all Israelite boy children into the Nile while saving their beloved son and brother's life. We traced his childhood with his birth family, his adolescence as a member of Pharaoh's household. We were dazzled with Moses by the bush that burned but was not consumed. We heard God's pledge to hear and respond to the cries of God's people who are suffering and oppressed, and God's call to take part in that response. We witnessed the Passover sacrifice, the sudden flight with unrisen bread dough, the dramatic crossing through the Red Sea, the washing away of Pharaoh's soldiers and chariots. We joined the Israelites in the wilderness, which did not feel like that much of a stretch from our current disorienting reality. We asked with them, is the Lord among us or not? We longed with them for something familiar. We hungered with them and thirsted with them and found our needs met in surprising ways by God's grace. Mediated through Moses' leadership, we received the instructions God offered of how to live in right relationship as God's people in faithful community. Now, there are more episodes of this saga, more twists and turns on this journey, but since Advent begins next week, it is time for us to conclude this series. And so today we heard the conclusion, not of the book of Exodus, but of the book of Deuteronomy, for the story of the Exodus continues beyond just one book. Here, this arc of the story concludes, just on the verge of the promised land. God brought Moses up to the top of a mountain and showed him the land across the Jordan River, the land of Canaan, the land, the story says, that God had promised to Abraham and Sarah and to their descendants so many generations ago. God let Moses take a good long look. And then God said, "But you will not cross over and enter that land." Now, some versions of the story say that this was God's judgment on Moses for the times when Moses' leadership left something to be desired. I don't think you'll be surprised to learn that's not really my theology. Some say that it was God's judgment on the Israelites for the times when their followership left something to be desired. I don't think you'll be surprised when I tell you that's not exactly my theology either. Some say Moses was simply too old to go on. Some say Moses had done all that he could do, and it was time to pass the baton to another leader with different gifts for the next stage of the journey. Some would even look to this as an example of a good, faithful, peaceful transition of power. Whatever the reason, God showed Moses the land for which he had striven so valiantly, and then Moses died there on the mountaintop opposite Jericho. And the people wept for Moses. They mourned for him for 30 days. The elders must have told stories to the younger ones, recounted Moses' early days, his confrontation with Pharaoh, their narrow escape through the Red Sea, all the adventures of their years in the wilderness. Maybe they serenaded one another with the songs that Moses and his sister Miriam were said to have sung on the shores of the sea after they eluded the grasping claws of Pharaoh's army. Surely they took time and made space to feel the grief of that loss, and perhaps to feel the grief of many other losses. For from back in Egypt to the journey of liberation, to that very moment, they had been on the run, focused only on survival. They had hardly stopped running, working, going and going and going, with little room for emotional processing of all their various traumas. So here, on the verge of completing this stage of their journey and beginning the next one, they stopped to feel the weight and to weep for all the griefs they had borne. The people wept and mourned for Moses, for all of their losses for 30 days. And then the story says the period of mourning was ended, and Joshua was raised up as the next leader. Actually, Moses had already given Joshua his blessing, knowing that he himself would not last forever, being mortal and all. So Joshua stepped forward and off they went on the next stage of their journey, which has twists and turns of its own. But I think they must still have been sad, even after those 30 days had ended. I think they still must have been sad. Don't you? Because grief doesn't operate on a smooth timetable. Just because someone says that the period of mourning has ended, that doesn't mean that we're back to business as usual with no lingering effects. Especially when it comes to trauma, there is no orderly, linear timeline for healing. Just because 30 days have gone by, or 60 days, or 100 days, or a year, or a decade, or a lifetime. Just because a certain period of time has gone by does not mean that we no longer feel the grief. And they had felt more than enough grief, hadn't they? We have felt more than enough grief, haven't we? I think they must have felt that twinge of grief, especially the next time the holidays came. Now, way back toward the beginning of the story, when they were still in Egypt about to escape, God spoke to Moses and taught them about the way that they were to commemorate the Passover in the future. Every year, a day of remembrance, a perpetual ordinance, a holiday, a festival. Moses dutifully instructed the people on this observance, but now here they were on the verge of entering the land for which they had yearned for so long. And when they celebrated the holidays there in Canaan, when they remembered the Passover, just as they had promised to do, they would have to do so without Moses. When they ate the unleavened bread, perhaps they would remember eating manna in the desert with Moses. When they drank the ritual cups of wine, perhaps they remembered the water Moses had brought forth from a rock at God's command when the people were dying of thirst. When they recounted the story of their journey of liberation, they could not help but remember Moses, the one who had led them through so many trials and tribulations until the very cusp of their goal. As they celebrated the holiday, they could not help but remember Moses and miss Moses, I think, just as many of us will do this week at Thanksgiving dinners, much quieter than we wish they were. The Israelites must have celebrated that first Passover in the land of Canaan with an ache in their hearts and an empty place at their tables, and not just for Elijah. I hope they allowed themselves space and time to feel the complex feelings of it all. I hope they held space for their grief at Moses' death, for their gratitude for his life and leadership, for their anger and frustration with the places he fell short, for their sadness and regret at their own shortcomings, for their celebration of God's goodness and faithfulness and liberating spirit through it all. I hope we will do the same in our Thanksgiving celebrations this week. I hope we will allow ourselves space and time to feel the complex feelings of it all. I hope we will hold space for our grief at all we have lost in this pandemic season, the lives, the health, the experiences, the jobs, the homes, the programs, the opportunities, the financial stability, the sense of security, and so much more. I hope we will hold space for anger and frustration at the ways in which a lack of leadership at the federal level has allowed the pandemic to spin way out of control in this nation. I hope we will hold space for sadness and regret at our own struggles, the things we feel powerless to change. I hope we will hold space also for gratitude at God's goodness and faithfulness and liberating spirit through it all. I hope the Israelites allowed themselves space and time to feel all those complex feelings, and I hope we will too. I hope they also felt a sense of consolation, and I hope we do as well. I hope they know, and I hope we know, that Moses and all our absent loved ones are yet with God. Did you catch it in the reading as Jane spoke it for us this morning? It went by quickly. It's almost a little bit obscure, perhaps even on purpose. The verse that describes Moses' burial. He buried him, it says, in a valley in the land of Moab, and no one knows to this day where that site was. But the original Hebrew and some translations seem to suggest that it was actually God who buried Moses. God who gathered up his remains and placed them tenderly and reverently in a holy place. God who covered that faithful servant's face for the last time. God who marked the grave so that God would know where it was. Perhaps God who visited, perhaps God who visits still. Whether we are missing loved ones who have died from COVID or from any other cause, who've crossed the threshold from this life to the next and are now at home in God's own heart, or whether we are missing loved ones who are alive and well but staying in their homes out of love and care for us and for others, we can trust, as the Israelites could trust, that our loved ones and we ourselves are held securely by the one who breathed us to life and breathes in us still. And because our loved ones are with God, and because God is with us, we are somehow yet together. We can grieve and we can move forward faithfully, both at the same time. And because God is in the business of bringing hope out of despair, joy out of sorrow, love out of hate, life out of death, because this moment on the cusp of the land of Canaan is not the end of the story, we also can trust that this time of separation will not be the end for us, and that God is even now working to make all things new. Thanks be to God.